We will continue with Domain 11, Frontier Explorers. We left off yesterday wondering if Daniel Boone would get answers to his questions, and we continue today with the story titled Crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Daniel Boone continued to explore the Appalachian Mountains, always on the lookout for a path that might lead him to the other side. One day, he was visited by an old friend, John Finley. As the two men talked, Daniel told John of his desire to find a way to cross the mountains. To his great surprise, Finley replied, "What? I know a way. I've crossed the Appalachian Mountains myself." He told Daniel that he knew of several big gaps in the mountains. Formed by rushing water years ago, the natural gaps, or passes, through the mountains had been trampled down first by buffalo and later by Native Americans. One pass was not too far from where Daniel Boone and his family lived. It's in Virginia, and it's called the Cumberland Gap, Finley told him. "We have to follow an old Native American footpath to find it." Boone was delighted. He asked John Finley to show him how to find it. Not long after that, the two men set off with 4 other men on a big adventure to find the Cumberland Gap. They walked and rode on horseback for many miles before reaching the beaten path that led up to a steep side of the mountain. They spent long days climbing up and up and up. Daniel's skills as a woodsman helped him identify animal tracks and follow the Native American footpath. They were overjoyed to reach the top of the mountains, where they could see a magnificent river stretching out beneath them. Following a narrow footpath, the men finally made it to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, to the land that is now known as Kentucky. Daniel and his friends were pleased with what they found on the other side of the mountains. The land was rich and fertile, and there were great herds of buffalo grazing on grasses. For the next 2 years, Daniel Boone stayed in eastern Kentucky, hunting and trapping wild animals. When he finally returned to North Carolina, he was met by the other settlers who expressed an interest in leaving their homes in the east and moving westward. These pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. "It's not an easy trip," Boone told them. "The forests are dense, and there are many dangers along the trail." But the pioneering spirit of these settlers remained strong. 2 years later, they convinced Daniel that they were serious about making the hard and dangerous trip to wilderness lands. And so, Daniel led his own family, along with several other families, back through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. However, the trip proved even harder for families than it had been for the woodsmen. The families were not used to living in the wild outdoors like the woodsmen. Setting up a settlement in Kentucky was more difficult than the pioneers expected, and they were forced to go back home over the Appalachian Mountains. Soon after, a rich man bought land in eastern Kentucky from the Native American Cherokee tribes. This rich man wanted to sell the land to families so they could live on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. First, there needed to be a clearly marked trail so that pioneers would not lose their way as they crossed the mountains. The rich man had heard of the adventuresome and talented trailblazer named, you guessed it, Daniel Boone. He asked him to blaze or create a trail that the pioneers could follow. Daniel Boone gathered together a group of men to help him clear the forest through the wilderness. Together, they worked through rain, snow, and mud. Their axes chopped down trees and bushes to widen the old Native American footpath so that the pioneers' wagons would fit. They built log bridges across streams, and Daniel Boone and the men successfully cleared a trail from eastern Virginia through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky. Their trail became known as the Wilderness Road. Pioneers from Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania began to move along the Wilderness Road in great numbers. By the time that Kentucky was declared a state, less than 20 years after the trail was blazed, more than 100,000 people had used the Wilderness Road. Daniel Boone's hard work was responsible for opening up the area known as the West to many pioneers. As more and more settlers streamed into the West, relationships with Native Americans who were already living there became even more strained, to say the least. Daniel Boone's own family was the first pioneer family to settle in Kentucky. Daniel chose a spot near the Kentucky River to build a fort. It took several years to complete the fort, about as large as one city block. The fort sheltered log cabins and people that lived in them. The fort was named Boonesboro after Daniel Boone, the man who built it. Life was difficult for the pioneers in the beginning, but people kept streaming across the mountains. In fact, so many people came that Daniel Boone felt his wilderness was being destroyed. It was no longer a wilderness land. He never gave up his love for the wilderness and continued to explore land to the west of Kentucky until his death at the age of 86. And tomorrow we will explore more about moving westward across the land that became known as the United States of America.